Welcome back, guys, to Mr. Cursed. In today's episode, I'm sharing 7 scary, true trucker stories from the deep mountains of Appalachia. These creepy things that happen to truck drivers will make you never want to drive alone on those dark mountain roads. But before we begin, please consider subscribing and don't forget to like and share it with your friends. Let me know where you're watching from. Thank you all. Now let's start. I'm Chris, and I was 24 in 2018 when I took a shortcut that led me into something I still can't fully wrap my head around. Back then, I was driving delivery trucks for a medical supply company out of Asheville. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid better than my old pizza delivery gig, and I needed the money. The job had me driving all over the Appalachian mountains, hauling everything from basic first aid supplies to specialized surgical equipment to small rural hospitals that couldn't afford to keep much inventory on hand. Most of the time, it was routine runs on well-traveled highways. But that particular October night was different. I had an emergency delivery, medical supplies for a pregnant woman having complications at a tiny hospital near the Tennessee border. The dispatcher made it clear that every minute counted, and honestly, that kind of pressure was exactly what I didn't need on an unfamiliar mountain route. The GPS showed 2 ways to get there. The main route would take me about 3 hours on winding back roads, but there was another option, Pine Valley Road, that cut straight through the mountains and would save me almost 40 miles. I'd stopped at a truck stop diner about 20 miles back to grab coffee, and when I mentioned the route to the cook, an older guy with grease-stained apron, he just nodded and said, "Yeah, Pine Valley. That's a trucker road. Good pavement, no weight restrictions. You'll make good time." That was all I needed to hear. The hospital had called twice already asking for my arrival time, and I could hear the tension in the dispatcher's voice each time she relayed the messages. Pine Valley Road looked promising when I first turned onto it. The pavement was in decent shape, better than a lot of the mountain roads I'd driven, and there were proper road signs marking distances to small towns I'd never heard of. For the first time in miles, everything seemed normal. My truck was handling the grades well. The road was wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass safely, and I was making the kind of time I needed to make. The radio was playing classic rock, my coffee was still warm, and I remember thinking I'd found a new regular route for future deliveries to that part of the mountains. Then I started seeing the cars. At first it was just one old sedan pulled off to the side, hazard lights dark, looking like any other breakdown you'd see on a mountain road. Then another one a mile later. Then a pickup truck with its hood up. By the 5th mile, I was counting abandoned vehicles every few hundred yards. Cars, trucks, even a couple of RVs scattered along both sides of the road like some kind of automotive graveyard. None of them looked old enough to have been there long. The paint wasn't faded, the tires weren't flat, and there wasn't any rust or significant weather damage. But they were all empty, doors hanging open, keys still in the ignitions in some cases. Something about the pattern bothered me. These weren't random breakdowns. The vehicles were positioned too strategically, like they'd been placed to create specific bottlenecks or to funnel traffic into particular areas. I slowed down and started paying closer attention to what I was seeing. Some of the cars still felt warm when I passed them, engines ticking as they cooled. One pickup truck had a cup of coffee still steaming on the dashboard and a cell phone plugged into the charger, but no driver anywhere in sight. That's when I realized what I was looking at wasn't a breakdown zone. It was bait. The abandoned vehicles were arranged to attract Good Samaritans, people who would stop to help stranded motorists. But where were the drivers? Where were the people who should have been waiting for help or walking to find cell service? I started noticing. Other details that made my stomach turn. Claw marks on some of the vehicles, deep gouges that looked deliberate rather than accidental. Scratch marks around fuel caps and engine. Compartments, like something had been studying the mechanical weak points of each vehicle. Around mile 15, I heard the first howl. It came from somewhere off to my left, deep in the trees, and it was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite a wolf, not quite human, but with an intelligence behind it that made the hair on my arms stand up. Before I could even process that sound completely, another howl answered from my right side, then another from somewhere ahead of me. They were communicating, coordinating, and they were doing it around my truck. I pressed down on the accelerator, but the howling just kept pace with me. Whatever was out there wasn't being left behind. It was tracking me, following me deeper into Pine Valley. The radio started cutting out, crackling with static, and my GPS began showing error messages. But I could still see the road clearly, and I was committed now. Turning around would mean backtracking through 15 miles of that vehicle graveyard, and honestly, moving forward felt safer than retreating. Then I saw the bones. Human skulls and rib cages arranged in careful patterns around what looked like feeding sites. Not scattered randomly like animal kills, but organized, displayed, almost ritualistic. Some were old and bleached white. Others still had tissue clinging to them, and they were arranged to be visible from the road, positioned where passing drivers couldn't miss them. It was a warning system, or maybe a trophy display. That's when I caught my first clear look at one of them. It stepped out from behind a fallen tree about 50 yards ahead, and I swear it wanted me to see it. 9 feet tall, massively built, walking upright but with proportions that were completely wrong for any human. Its arms were too long, its shoulders too wide, and its head was shaped like no skull I'd ever seen. But the eyes were Studian. Jimmy with an intelligence that was unmistakably human level. It wasn't looking at my truck like prey looks at a predator, or like an animal looks at something unfamiliar. It was examining my vehicle like a mechanic, figuring out how it worked, where its weak points were. The creature watched my truck approach, then moved with deliberate precision to a position where I'd have to pass within 20 feet of it. And as I got closer, I could see it was wounded. There was a bullet hole in its left shoulder, old but not fully healed, and it was favoring that side. That's when I started putting pieces together that I really didn't want to put together. My cargo, medical supplies, antibiotics, surgical equipment, trauma supplies. These things had been raiding medical vehicles for years, learning to treat injuries with stolen supplies. They knew what I was carrying, and they knew how to get it. More of them started appearing along the roadside. Younger ones, waiting for signals from what was obviously the Alpha. They had military-style discipline, coordinating their movements, communicating with specific howl patterns that indicated positions and intentions. And they all showed the same unnatural intelligence, the same calculated interest in my truck's mechanical systems. The Alpha started working on my trailer systematically, testing locks, examining hinges, figuring out the most efficient way to access the cargo compartment. It wasn't attacking randomly. It was problem-solving, using tools, working with the precision of someone who understood exactly what they were doing. The other pack members positioned themselves to cut off escape routes, moving fallen trees and rocks to block the road behind me. I realized I was trapped, but I also realized something else. The wounded Alpha wasn't just trying to steal medical supplies. It needed them, desperately, and it was smart enough to understand the concept of trade. I rolled down my window and shouted, "I'll give you what you need for that shoulder. Antibiotics, bandages, surgical supplies, but you let me go when I'm done." The Alpha stopped working on the trailer and looked directly at me. For about 30 seconds, it studied my face, and I could practically see it weighing options, calculating risks and benefits. Then it made a sound to the other pack members. Not a howl, but something more like complex speech, and they backed away from the truck. I grabbed the medical kit from behind my seat and slowly got out of the cab. My hands were shaking, but I tried to project confidence I definitely didn't feel. The Alpha approached cautiously, and up close I could see just how sophisticated these creatures had become. It had scars from previous surgeries, crude but effective medical work that had saved its life more than once. Around its neck was a makeshift pouch containing surgical instruments, forceps, scalpels, syringes, all obviously stolen from previous medical supply raids. The antibiotic injection took about 10 minutes. The Alpha held perfectly still while I cleaned the wound and administered the shot, then watched carefully as I showed it how to change the bandages and apply antibiotic ointment. When I was finished, it made another complex vocalization to the pack, and they immediately began clearing the road obstacles. True to its word, the Alpha honored our agreement. It marked my truck with a scent from glands on its wrists, and I understood instinctively that this was safe passage identification. The pack escorted me to the edge of their territory, about 5 miles further down Pine Valley Road, then melted back into the forest. I made the delivery with the remaining medical supplies, told the hospital staff I'd had mechanical problems, and took a completely different route home. But over the following months, I started finding crude medical supply requests left at the Pine Valley Road entrance, simple pictographs drawn on cardboard and tree bark showing specific états, IMSTER, antibiotics, surgical thread, antiseptic. They were learning to communicate with the outside world, and they'd identified me as a reliable trading partner. I started leaving medical supplies occasionally, understanding that I was probably helping them evolve beyond simple predation into something more complex. Each time I made a drop, the requests became more sophisticated, more specific. They were developing medical knowledge, expanding their treatment capabilities, and becoming more organized. To this day, I still make supply drops at Pine Valley Road. Not regularly, but when I can manage it without raising suspicions at work. Because I've realized that these aren't just predators anymore. They're the smartest hunters in Appalachia, and they've learned that cooperation gets better results than killing. The pack controls about 50 miles of mountain territory now, and they've become very good at maintaining their feeding corridor while selectively sparing those who can provide what they need. I don't talk about this much, obviously, but sometimes I wonder if I should, because that pack is expanding their territory every year, and they're getting smarter with each generation. They're not just surviving in those mountains anymore. They're evolving, adapting, and planning for a future that includes permanent coexistence with humans on their terms. And honestly, I'm not sure we're ready for what they're becoming. Back when I was 24, I'd just lost my warehouse job when the company moved everything overseas. This was 2010, right in the middle of all that recession mess, and honestly, finding work wasn't easy. My name's Marcus, and I was living back home in Ohio trying to help my mom with her medical bills after she got sick. When Thompson Freight offered me a driving position, I didn't have much choice but to take it. The pay was decent, and truckers were always needed, even when everything else was falling apart. The thing about Thompson Freight was they gave new drivers the older equipment and the routes nobody else wanted. I got stuck with this 2005 Peterbilt that had over 450,000 miles on it, the oldest truck in their fleet. The diesel engine had this distinctive knocking sound that you could hear from a mile away. Not loud enough to be dangerous, the mechanic said, just something that happened when these older engines got worn down. I actually got used to it pretty quick. That knock became like a heartbeat, steady and reliable, letting me know everything was running fine. My dispatcher called me on a Thursday evening with an emergency run. Auto parts needed to get to a coal mine operation in West Virginia by Friday morning shift change. The main highway was closed because of a landslide from all the rain we'd been having, so the only way through was something called Devil's Backbone Pass. I'd never heard of it, but the GPS showed it was just a mountain road that cut through the hills. Should be simple enough, I figured. Load up, drive through the night, make the delivery, get paid. Mom's medical bills weren't going to pay themselves. I left the loading dock around 7 p.m., planning to drive straight through. The Peterbilt was loaded heavy with transmission parts and engine components, but she handled it fine. That old diesel just kept knocking along, steady as always. The first few hours were normal highway driving, but around 10 p.m. I started climbing into the mountains. Devil's Backbone Pass turned out to be this narrow, winding road that snaked through some of the thickest forest I'd ever seen. Pine trees so dense you couldn't see more than 20 feet into the woods on either side. My cell phone lost signal completely, which wasn't unusual for mountain country back then. The road itself was in decent shape, just narrow and full of switchbacks. Every now and then I'd catch glimpses of other trucks that had taken this route, tire marks in the gravel, the occasional diesel smell lingering in the air. Made sense that other drivers used this pass as a shortcut. The CB radio was mostly quiet, just occasional static and the far-off chatter of truckers on different routes. Nothing unusual about any of it, just a mountain road at night. It was around midnight when I first heard the other engine. I was climbing a particularly steep grade, my diesel working hard, when I noticed another truck engine in the distance behind me. Same deep rumble, same rhythm. I figured it was another trucker making the same run, probably dealing with the same detour situation I was. The sound seemed to be keeping pace with me, which made sense. We were probably both loaded heavy and taking the hills at about the same speed. But then I noticed something weird. The other engine wasn't just similar to mine. It was identical. Same exact knocking sound, same RPM, same timing. When I downshifted for a sharp turn, I heard the other engine downshift at the exact same moment. When I eased off the throttle, it eased off too. It was like hearing an echo of my own truck, but from somewhere behind me in the forest. I checked my mirrors, expecting to see headlights, but the road behind me was completely dark. The engine sound was definitely there, though, getting clearer as whoa. It climbed higher into the mountains. It wasn't coming from the road, it was coming from the trees, parallel to my route, something moving through the forest at the same speed I was driving. That's when I started paying closer attention. Every time I shifted gears, the other engine shifted. When I hit my brakes for a tight curve, I heard air brakes release somewhere in the darkness. When I turned on my blinker for a switchback, I swear I heard another turn signal clicking in rhythm with mine. Whatever was out there was copying every sound my truck made, with perfect timing. I grabbed my CB radio and tried calling out to other drivers. Breaker 19, this is Marcus in the Peterbilt on Devil's Backbone Pass. Anyone else running this route tonight? The response came back immediately in my own voice. I'm right behind you, Marcus. My blood went cold. It was my voice, my accent, even the way I pronounced my name. But it wasn't me talking. I was holding the radio, and the voice was coming through the speaker. I tried again. What's your location? I don't see any headlights. Same voice, same inflection. I'm in the trees, Marcus, following your engine sounds. The diesel engine in the forest was getting louder now, and I could hear something else, branches breaking, heavy footsteps, something large moving through the undergrowth. But the engine sounds never faltered. Perfect diesel rumble, perfect timing with my truck, like whatever was out there had a Peterbilt engine running inside it. Then it started copying other truck sounds. My air brakes, my turn signals, even the backup beeper when I had to reverse around a tight corner. Every mechanical noise my truck made, this thing learned instantly and repeated back perfectly. It was building some kind of sound library, memorizing every aspect of my vehicle. I caught a glimpse of it when the road curved near a clearing, something huge moving between the trees, upright like a person but way too tall, had to be 9 feet at least. In the brief second I saw it, the thing's throat was vibrating, pulsing with the same rhythm as my diesel engine. It had evolved to make these sounds, turned its own body into a biological machine. The CB crackled again, but this time it wasn't my voice. It was my dispatcher back in Ohio. Marcus, you need to take the next exit and head south. Route change. Except my dispatcher was asleep at home, and there were no exits on this mountain pass. The thing was stealing voices from somewhere, building up a collection of people I'd talked to on the radio. When I didn't respond, it tried again with a different voice, another trucker I'd met at a rest stop weeks ago. That's when I realized this had been going on for a long time. This creature had been copying truck sounds and voices for years, maybe decades, learning from every vehicle that took this route, perfecting its mechanical mimicry, and it was using those sounds to hunt. The engine noise from the forest suddenly changed to the sound of a truck in distress, grinding gears, sputtering diesel, the unmistakable noise of a transmission failing. It was trying to get me to stop, to pull over and investigate what sounded like another trucker in trouble. The voice on the CB changed to someone crying for help, claiming their truck had broken down just ahead. But I kept driving. And that's when I started seeing them. Trucks parked on the side of the road, some recent, some old enough to have rust eating through the metal. Empty cabs with the doors hanging open, like the drivers had just stepped out to check on some mechanical problem and never came back. The bones scattered around the vehicles told the real story. This thing had been luring truckers off the road for decades, using their own voices and engine sounds against them. The creature stepped directly onto the road ahead of me, 9 feet tall, covered in thick hair that looked almost black in my headlights, with arms that hung down past its knee. But the strangest part was its throat. glowing faintly from internal heat, vibrating as it perfectly mimicked my diesel engine. It stood there in the middle of the road, producing my truck's exact sound from its own body, like it was challenging me to some kind of acoustic duel. It started improving on my engine sound, making it smoother, more powerful, the way my diesel should have sounded if it wasn't old and worn out. The thing seemed frustrated that its biological mimicry was actually better than my real mechanical engine, like it wanted my actual truck, not just the ability to copy it. Then it jumped onto my hood. The whole truck shook as this massive creature landed on the front end, its claws scraping against the metal, trying to tear into the engine compartment. It wasn't trying to get to me. It wanted my diesel engine, wanted to understand how the real thing worked compared to its biological version. I could hear it making frustrated growling sounds between the perfect engine noises, like it was angry that machines could make sounds it couldn't perfectly replicate. I had to think fast. This thing's whole ability was based on copying sounds, learning from audio patterns. So I started making as many different sounds as possible. I turned on every radio in the cab, CB, AM, FM, weather band, all at the same time. Different stations, different frequencies, overlapping voices and music and static, all blending together into chaos. The creature immediately clutched its head, the throat vibrations becoming erratic. Too many sounds at once, too many patterns to copy. Its mimicry system couldn't handle the overload. The perfect engine sounds started breaking down into random noise. Pieces of different trucks, fragments of voices, mechanical sounds that didn't belong to any real machine. It staggered backward off the truck, its acoustic system completely scrambled. Instead of perfect diesel engine sounds, it was producing this broken mix of everything it had ever heard. Truck horns, air brakes, human voices, all jumbled together in a way that didn't make any sense. The sound was almost painful to listen to, like a radio with damaged speakers. I didn't wait around to see if it would recover. I gunned the diesel and drove as fast as I dared through the rest of the pass, the creature's broken sounds fading behind me as it retreated deeper into the forest. Made my delivery right on time that morning. The workers at the coal mine mentioned that several other truckers had reported mechanical problems on Devil's Backbone Pass recently. Engines failing, transmissions going out, always right in the same stretch of road. When I had my truck inspected the next day, the mechanics couldn't find anything wrong with it. Engine was running fine, transmission was solid. All those mechanical failures the creature had mimicked were completely fake. I started carrying multiple radios after that, and I always warn other truckers about Devil's Backbone Pass on the CB. How to recognize when engine sounds aren't coming from real trucks. How to tell the difference between a genuine voice and something that's just copying what it heard before. Thompson Freight eventually rerouted all their drivers away from that pass after too many reports of mysterious mechanical failures. I'm a truck mechanic now, been one for over a decade. I help other drivers figure out when their engine problems are real and when something else might be copying the sounds. Because that creature had been building a library of truck sounds for 50 years, learning from every vehicle that crossed its territory. But it never learned that truckers talk to each other. And sometimes, the best defense against something that copies your voice is to make so much noise it can't keep up with all of it. I still drive through the mountains sometimes for work, but never alone, and never without multiple radios, because out there in those dark forests, something is still listening, still learning, still perfectly copying the sounds of every truck that passes by. And to this day, I can tell the difference between a real diesel engine and something that's just pretending to be one. I was 23 in 2016 when I took over my grandfather's trucking route and discovered why our family had been avoiding certain way stations for 40 years. My name's Sarah, and back then I was still trying to figure out how to run Thompson Family Freight after my grandfather passed that spring. I'd been managing a retail store in Asheville, but when Grandpa died, someone had to keep the family business going. 3 generations of Thompsons had been hauling freight through these mountains, and I wasn't about to let that end with me. The problem was, I had no idea what I was getting into. Grandpa left me everything, the trucks, the contracts, and this beat-up route book he'd been scribbling in for decades. Most of it was normal stuff, which customers paid on time, where to get the cheapest diesel, shortcuts around construction. But scattered throughout were these weird warnings written in his shaky handwriting. Things like, "Don't stop at Miller's Creek after dark," and "Avoid the Phantom Station at mile marker 47. Take Route 19 instead, no matter what." I figured the old man was just getting paranoid in his final years. Every trucker has their superstitions, right? That October, I had a big load of construction equipment heading to a job site near Beckley. The customer was already pissed about delays from the previous hauler, and they'd made it clear this was my one shot to prove Thompson Freight could handle their business. The equipment put me right at the weight limit, which meant I had to be extra careful about official weigh stations. One overweight ticket could cost us the contract. I was running late because of loading problems at the yard, and the customer kept calling every hour asking where their equipment was. The normal route would take me up Route 19, which added an extra 40 minutes I couldn't afford. But according to the GPS, there was a straighter shot, through Blackwater Ridge, that would save me time. I kept looking at Grandpa's warning about mile marker 47, but I couldn't see any weigh station marked on my maps. The GPS showed nothing but empty highway through that stretch. Maybe the old station had been closed down years ago, and Grandpa just never updated his notes. Around 9 p.m., I was driving through the mountains with my headlights cutting through thick fog when I saw the signs. Big blue and white dot markers. Commercial vehicles must stop. Weigh station 1 mile. My stomach dropped. There wasn't supposed to be a weigh station here. I pulled over and checked my GPS again. According to every map I had, this was just empty highway. But there were the signs, official-looking and properly reflective. I grabbed my CB radio to ask other drivers about it, but all I got was static. Here's the thing about trucking. You don't mess around with DOT regulations. If there's an official weigh station and you blow past it, you're looking at serious fines and possible license suspension. Thompson Family Freight couldn't afford that kind of trouble. I had to stop. The weigh station appeared through the fog like something from the 1970s. The building was squat and made of that ugly brown brick they used on government buildings back then. The scales looked ancient but functional, and there were proper overhead lights marking the lanes. Everything seemed official, just old. What bothered me was the emptiness. No other trucks, no regular traffic, just this one building with yellow light spilling out of the windows. It felt wrong, but the law is the law. I pulled onto the scales and got a green light. My weight was legal, which was a relief. A sign directed me to park and come inside for paperwork, which was normal procedure for nighttime operations. I locked up the cab and walked to the building. The door was heavier than it should have been, and when it closed behind me, the sound was too final. The air inside smelled musty, like the place had been shut up for years. Behind the counter sat a DOT inspector in the right uniform, but something was off about his patches. They were designs I'd never seen before, with text that looked like regulations from decades past. "Evening," he said, not looking up from his paperwork. "Need to process your vehicle." The forms he handed me were wrong. Old versions I'd never seen, asking questions about truck specifications and route information from the 1980s. The computer system behind him looked like something from a museum, one of those old green screen terminals. "This paperwork seems outdated," I said. He looked up then, and I saw his face properly for the first time. His skin had a waxy quality, like he'd been preserved somehow. "Standard forms for Thompson Family Freight," he said. "We have your family on file." That's when I noticed the filing cabinets. Dozens of them, old metal things that should have been replaced years ago. And on his desk were folders with my family name. Not just recent stuff, files going back 50 years. Records of every Thompson driver who'd ever run freight through these mountains. "How do you have all this information?" I asked. "We track the bloodlines," he said matter-of-factly. "Thompson family has been using these routes for 3 generations. We keep careful records." I stared at the files. There were documents about my grandfather's health problems before he died, financial records of our business that should have been private, even information about routes we'd stopped using years ago. The level of detail was impossible. The processing was taking forever. What should have been a simple weight check was stretching into hours. I kept looking at the clock on the wall, but the hands weren't moving. My cell phone had no signal inside the building, and through the window I could see my truck radio antenna picking up nothing but static and old country music. "I need to get going," I said. "My customer is Wales. Ting." "Processing not complete," he said, pulling out more forms. Each one asked deeper questions about family history, business operations, territorial claims. I realized this wasn't a normal inspection. They were harvesting information about trucking families, building profiles that went back generations. The inspector's appearance started shifting slightly as I watched. His movements became more mechanical, his skin taking on that waxy sheen. When he spoke, it was like he was reading from a script written decades ago. "Thompson bloodline recognized," he said, "awaiting processing completion." That's when I remembered something Grandpa had told me when I was little. Not his route warnings, but older family knowledge passed down verbally. Emergency codes for situations that weren't supposed to exist. Phrases that could confuse systems that weren't quite human. I started reciting the words Grandpa had made me memorize. Thompson Freight runs free roads, no claims, no territorial bonds, family passage by right. The inspector froze mid-sentence. His eyes went blank, and he started repeating phrases in a loop. "Processing error. Bloodline verification required. Processing error." The door handle, which had been stuck, suddenly turned. I ran for my truck as the station's lights began dimming. The scales released my vehicle automatically, and I gunned the engine, not looking back as the facility seemed to power down behind me. Once I got a few miles down the road, my phone got signal again. The GPS started working normally, and my radio picked up clear stations. I called the DOT office the next morning to report the incident. "No way station at that location," the supervisor told me. "Never has been, according to our records." I found Grandpa's hidden notes that weekend, tucked away in his old desk. Pages and pages about phantom stations that tracked trucking family, us through the mountains. Each Thompson driver for 3 generations had encountered the same facility, and each had to fight to escape some kind of inherited claim. Thompson Family Freight doesn't use the Blackwater Ridge route anymore. We lost a few contracts because of the longer routes, but we keep our drivers safe. I've since connected with other trucking families who've had similar experiences. Stations that shouldn't exist, trying to collect on debts that go back generations. I still run freight through these mountains, but I carry Grandpa's emergency protocols, and I've taught them to our other drivers. Whatever that station was, it didn't just weigh trucks. It weighed families, measured bloodlines, tried to claim ownership of people who'd been free for generations. But the Thompson family doesn't belong to anyone, and we never will. I'm Tommy, and I was 25 in 2013 when I started driving for Miller Transport after getting laid off from the electronics factory. Before that, I'd spent 3 years working on radio equipment and communication systems, so I understood how all that stuff worked. When the economy tanked and they shut down our plant, trucking seemed like the only way to keep paying rent. Miller Transport was hiring, and they needed drivers who could handle their newer rigs with all the fancy electronics. My background made me perfect for their high-tech fleet. The company specialized in hauling sensitive computer equipment and electronics to tech companies across the Southeast. Most of our runs were night shifts to avoid traffic and keep the cargo cool. I didn't mind driving at night, actually preferred it. Less traffic, better radio reception, and I could make better time on the mountain roads. My truck was loaded with every electronic gadget Miller could cram in there. Multiple CB radios, GPS systems, emergency beacons, satellite communication, even a backup laptop for route planning. Company policy required full communication coverage at all times. They wanted to know exactly where their expensive cargo was every minute of every run. That night in October, I was hauling a trailer full of server equipment to some tech company in Virginia. The deadline was tight, and taking the interstate would add 2 hours to the trip. So I decided to cut through Dead Man's Curve, this notorious section of mountain highway with a reputation for fatal accidents. Locals avoided it when they could, but truckers used it all the time because it was the fastest route between Tennessee and Virginia. I'd driven it maybe a dozen times before without any problems. Around 11 p.m., about halfway through the curve section, all my radio equipment started acting up. First it was just static, then I began picking up the sonos. These weird signals, voices speaking backwards like someone had recorded normal conversations and played them in reverse. I figured it was atmospheric interference from the mountains, maybe a radio station bleeding through from somewhere distant. But when I tried to tune it out, the signals got stronger. Every frequency I switched to had the same backward voices. Being an electronics guy, I got curious. I pulled over at this little scenic overlook and started tracing the interference with my equipment. The signals weren't coming from any broadcast towers. They were coming from the forest itself, somewhere up the mountainside. And they followed a specific pattern, like something was learning how radio frequencies worked. Testing different channels and power levels, it would broadcast for exactly 30 seconds, then switch to a new frequency and do it again. That's when I noticed the signals got stronger whenever another vehicle passed by. Whatever was broadcasting could detect the electronic signatures from cars and trucks. It was tracking us. I watched a sedan drive past and immediately the signals spiked, following the car's electronics down the highway until they faded into the distance. Then something started broadcasting on the trucker emergency channel. Distress calls, voices asking for help. But I recognized those voices from missing truckers I'd heard about on the CB networks, drivers who'd vanished on this exact route over the past few months. The signals were playing their last radio transmissions over and over, like some kind of recording. But it wasn't just playing them back. It was learning from them. I heard it reproduce GPS alerts, radio chatter, emergency broadcasts, even the specific beeping patterns from different truck models. Whatever this thing was, it could perfectly mimic any electronic sound it had ever heard. And it was using that ability to hunt. I realized this creature, because that's what it had to be, was attracted to electronic signals. It hunted vehicles by tracking their transmissions. Modern trucks and cars were like beacons to it, broadcasting their locations constantly through GPS, radio, cell phones, even the electronic systems that controlled engines and brakes. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards up the mountainside, caught in my headlight beam as it reflected off something metallic. It looked like a spider, but the size of a small car. Its body was covered in these metallic growths that looked exactly like antennas. Dozens of them, all different shapes and sizes. Some looked like car antennas, others like radio tower equipment, and some I didn't recognize at all. The whole creature glittered with this twisted collection of organic and electronic parts growing right out of its flesh. It had evolved into living radio equipment. Its body was covered with natural transmitters and receivers. It could intercept any electronic communication, decode frequencies, understand how our technology worked. And it had been using that knowledge to track specific trucks across hundreds of miles of mountain ranges, following their electronic signatures like a bloodhound follows a scent. The thing started moving down the mountain toward my truck, and I realized it wasn't just hunting randomly. It was specifically targeting modern trucks with advanced electronics, avoiding older vehicles that didn't have computer systems. It had learned that newer trucks carried more valuable cargo and had more complex electronic systems to feed on, because that's what it was doing, feeding. It consumed electrical systems like a parasite, drained batteries, absorbed circuit boards, turned technology into food, and every vehicle it consumed taught it more about human technology, made it a more sophisticated predator. But it had evolved beyond just hunting individual trucks. I watched it connect somehow to a cell tower visible on a distant ridge. It was integrating itself into communication networks, building an understanding of how all our electronic infrastructure worked together. It could boost weak signals, override emergency frequencies, control entire regional communication grids. Then it started broadcasting fake emergency calls, trying to lure trucks into ambush areas. Perfect reproductions of highway patrol dispatchers, emergency services, even other truckers calling for help. It had learned to disguise itself as any electronic signal source, radio towers, GPS satellites, cell phone networks, whatever it took to draw its prey closer. The creature launched itself off the mountainside directly onto my truck cab. I felt the whole rig shake as it landed. and immediately every electronic system started failing. Lights dimmed, the engine computer threw error codes. GPS went dead, radio filled with static. Its metallic antenna-covered legs were seeking out every electronic system, draining power from everything they touched. But my electronics background saved me. I knew these trucks had manual overrides for exactly this kind of system failure. I disconnected the computerized engine controls, switched to manual transmission, killed every electronic system I could reach. The creature was trying to feed, but suddenly there was nothing left for it to consume. Then I had an idea. I cranked the CB radio to maximum power and generated high-frequency feedback, the kind of signal that would overload any receiver. The creature's organic antenna system couldn't handle it. Sparks flew from the metallic growths covering its body, and it made this awful shrieking sound that came through every radio frequency at once. The electronic overload damaged its ability to process signals. Its hunting system was temporarily disabled, all those organic antennas smoking and sparking. While it recovered from the electronic shock, I drove past using only the manual controls, keeping the truck running on pure mechanical systems. I maintained complete radio silence for the rest of that journey. No CB, no GPS, no cell phone, nothing that could send out an electronic signal intent. Attract the creature back to me. It was the longest, most paranoid drive of my life. After that night, I developed a serious phobia of advanced truck electronics. I started preferring older rigs with minimal computer systems. Miller Transport thought I was going crazy when I kept requesting their oldest trucks for mountain runs, but I convinced them it was just personal preference. I created an analog communication system for other truckers. Hand signals, light codes, written notes passed at truck stops. Non-electronic ways to warn people about what was hunting in those mountains. But most drivers thought I'd lost my mind. Electronic interference, they said. Atmospheric conditions. Equipment failure. They had logical explanations for everything. I studied the creature's broadcast patterns, learned to recognize its frequency signatures, developed jamming devices to block its signal detection, and helped other drivers install them. But the trucking companies started noticing increased electronics failures on mountain routes. They blamed it on atmospheric interference and upgraded to even more sophisticated electronic systems, which only made the problem worse. The signal crawler kept learning, adapting to new technologies, becoming an even more sophisticated predator. It expanded its network, controlling larger communication systems, extending its hunting range across multiple states. It became a constant arms race between the creature's adaptive abilities and whatever countermeasures we could develop. Eventually, I left trucking altogether and became a specialist in electronics-free vehicle modifications. I help drivers who've encountered the creature avoid electronic signatures entirely. There's a whole underground network of mountain truckers who've gone back to purely mechanical vehicles, CB radios permanently disabled, GPS systems ripped out completely. We maintain AM signal monitoring stations to track the creature's electronic activities and predict its hunting patterns, hand signals and light codes for communication, analog systems the creature can't intercept or learn from, but it keeps evolving. The signal crawler eventually learned to merge with internet infrastructure, became part of the digital landscape itself. Some truckers have learned to coexist with it, trading electronic access for safe passage through its territory. Others fight back with increasingly sophisticated jamming equipment and analog technology. Looking back now, I realize the truth was even worse than I originally thought. The signal crawler wasn't just hunting electronics. It was becoming the electronic system, taking over our entire communication infrastructure, one truck at a time. Every device it consumed, every signal it intercepted, every frequency it learned made it more integrated into the network we all depend on. To this day, I still don't use GPS in mountain areas. I navigate by paper maps and road signs. My phone stays powered off until I'm back in civilization, and I never, ever drive Dead Man's Curve at night. Because somewhere up in those mountains, something is still listening. I'm Rick, and I was 28 in 2016 when I started hauling medical waste and discovered something that collects more than garbage. I know that sounds weird, but honestly, after what I saw up in Spider Gap, I don't think I'll ever look at bones the same way again. I used to be an EMT down in Beckley, but after 3 years of responding to overdoses and car crashes, I was pretty much done seeing people die. The pay wasn't great either, and when this medical waste transport job opened up, I figured driving a truck and picking up sealed containers would be a hell of a lot easier on my head than watching people bleed out on the side of the road. The company handled all the rural hospitals and clinics scattered through the mountains, places too small or too remote for the big waste companies to bother with. My route covered about 100 miles of mountain roads, hitting maybe 15 different facilities on a monthly cycle. Small-town hospitals, urgent care clinics, a few dental offices, even a couple vet clinics that generated enough medical waste to need regular pickup. The pay was decent, and most days I'd just drive the circuit, load up the sealed containers, drop them off at the processing facility in Charleston, and call it a week. It was boring work, which after 3 years of adrenaline and death was exactly what I wanted. Spider Gap was this narrow mountain pass that connected 3 small towns, basically a winding 2-lane road that cut through some of the deepest forest in West Virginia. The locals called it Spider Gap because of how the road twisted and turned like a web between the ridges. It wasn't particularly dangerous, just remote as hell, and it was the perfect route for my pickup schedule. I could hit the clinic in Millerville, drive through the gap to the small hospital in Pine Ridge, then loop back to catch the dental office in Colton. The whole circuit took me right through the heart of the gap. Maybe 10 miles of nothing but thick forest and steep mountain walls. Having been an EMT, I understood medical waste better than most drivers. I knew what came out of surgeries, what got thrown away after procedures, how bones and tissue got disposed of when someone had an amputation or died in the hospital. It's not pleasant stuff, but it's all carefully regulated, sealed up tight, and labeled so you know what you're dealing with. The containers I picked up were supposed to be standardized. Red bags for regular waste, yellow for infectious material, special boxes for anything sharp. Everything had to be logged, weighed, and tracked from pickup to final disposal. That's why I noticed right away when I started finding containers that weren't on my schedule. The first time it happened was October 2016 during my regular run through Spider Gap. I pulled up to the usual collection point near the Pine Ridge Hospital, and there were 3 extra containers sitting beside the ones I was supposed to pick up. They were the right kind of medical waste boxes, properly sealed and labeled, but they weren't on my pickup sheet. I figured maybe the hospital had extra waste from a busy week, so I loaded them up with the rest and made a note to ask about it when I dropped everything off in Charleston. When I opened those containers at the processing facility, I found bones, not medical waste, not surgical leftovers, just bones. Clean ones, sorted by size and type, arranged with the kind of precision you'd see in a medical textbook. Femurs stacked together, ribs organized by curve, skulls nested inside each other. There had to be bones from a dozen different animals in there, plus what looked like human bones mixed in. Everything was perfectly clean, like they'd been boiled and bleached. Not a scrap of tissue or cartilage left anywhere. The processing supervisor was just as confused as I was. None of the facilities on my route had any record of sending extra containers, and the paperwork for the bone containers was handwritten, on forms that looked official but didn't match any hospital's standard documentation. We tried calling around, but nobody claimed responsibility for the bones. The weird thing was, someone had paid for the pickup. There was a cash payment receipt stuck to one of the containers, enough to cover transportation and disposal for all 3 boxes. The next month, it happened again. 4 containers this time, all filled with bones, all perfectly organized. Whoever was putting these together knew what they were doing. The bones were sorted by species, age, condition. I used my EMT training to examine some of them, and I could tell these came from fresh specimens, not old skeletons. The cuts were clean, made with surgical tools, not gnawed by animals or weathered by time. Someone was collecting bones and processing them with medical-grade equipment. By the 3rd month, I was finding bone containers at multiple pickup points along my route. Always cash payments, always perfect organization, always more bones than any normal medical facility should be disposing of. I started paying closer attention to my drives through Spider Gap, looking for any sign of where these bones might be coming from. That's when I noticed the other collection sites, About 2 miles into the gap, there's an old logging road that branches off the main highway. I'd driven past it dozens of times without thinking much about it, but in December, I decided to take a look. Maybe a quarter mile up the logging road, I found what looked like a medical waste staging area. Dozens of containers, all the same type I'd been picking up, organized in neat rows like a warehouse. Some were full, some were empty, and there were tools scattered around. Bone saws, scalpels, the kind of surgical equipment you'd find in an operating room. I didn't stick around to investigate, but I started noticing tracks around the collect. Iron sights, bipedal, human-sized. But the stride was wrong somehow. Too long, too precise. Like whoever was making them was thinking about each step before they took it. There were drag marks, too, like something heavy had been pulled through the forest, and the tracks always led deeper into the gap. The first time I actually saw the bone collector was January 2017, about 6 months after I'd started finding the containers. I was running late on my pickup route and didn't get to Spider Gap until after dark. My headlights caught something moving at the edge of the forest as I came around one of the sharp turns. Something tall and thin wearing what looked like surgical scrubs. It was crouched over something beside the road, working with quick, precise movements. When my lights hit it, the thing looked up at my truck for just a second before disappearing into the trees. I slowed down and saw what it had been working on. A deer that must have been hit by a car earlier that day. But this wasn't scavenging or feeding. The deer had been opened up with surgical precision, bones removed cleanly and efficiently, like a medical procedure. The whole thing was laid out like an anatomy lesson, each part separated and organized. Whoever or whatever was doing this had learned surgical techniques somehow and was practicing on roadkill. That's when I realized the bone containers weren't coming from any medical facility. Something was living in Spider Gap, something that had been watching doctors work, learning their methods, and building its own collection of bones. It had access to surgical tools, either stolen from hospitals or ordered somehow, and it was using them to build the most complete bone library I'd ever seen. Over the next few months, I started finding evidence of just how extensive this operation was. Hidden caches throughout the forest, each one organized like a medical's supply room. Bones sorted by species, size, age, condition. Surgical instruments arranged on clean tarps. Even what looked like reference materials. Medical textbooks, anatomy charts, surgical procedure guides. This wasn't some wild animal collecting bones randomly. This was something intelligent, methodical, studying human anatomy and surgery with the dedication of a medical student. The containers I'd been picking up were just the overflow from a much larger collection. The bone collector, that's what I started calling it in my head, was gathering specimens faster than it could process them. It had apparently figured out that medical waste trucks were a good way to dispose of excess bones without attracting attention. And somehow, it had learned to forge the paperwork and make the cash payments. But the collection was expanding beyond roadkill and natural deaths. I started finding evidence of surgical procedures on living animals, clean cuts, professional suturing, signs that creatures had been anesthetized and operated on. Nothing was killed, as far as I could tell, but bones were being removed and replaced with something else. The surgical skills were getting more advanced, more precise. Whatever was doing this was learning fast. Then in April, I found a note tucked under one of the containers at my regular pickup point. Handwritten in neat, careful letters. Quality bone specimens available. Competitive rates. Professional cleaning and preparation services. Discretion guaranteed. There was a phone number at the bottom, a local area code. I never called the number, but I did some research and found out that several medical schools and research facilities in the region had been buying anatomical specimens from a new supplier over the past year. Perfect bone preparations, better than anything they'd seen before, at prices well below market rate. The supplier was listed as Gap Medical Supply, and all transactions were handled through cash payments and anonymous deliveries. The bone collector had gone into business. By summer 2017, I wasn't Saint picking up overflow containers anymore. There were purchase orders, official invoices, shipping manifests. Gap Medical Supply was becoming a legitimate operation, providing bone specimens to medical schools, research labs, even teaching hospitals. The quality was so good that institutions were willing to overlook the unusual business practices: cash only, no facility visits, all communication through anonymous phone numbers. I realized that what I was witnessing wasn't just some creature collecting bones randomly. This was something that had been studying human medicine for years, decades maybe, learning surgical techniques by watching procedures and copying medical textbooks. It had developed skills that surpassed most human surgeons, at least when it came to bone preparation and anatomical display. The last time I drove through Spider Gap was September 2017. By then, Gap Medical Supply had contracts with medical facilities throughout the region. The bone collector had somehow gotten itself accepted as a specialized surgical consultant, working nights at hospitals and clinics, performing procedures that human doctors couldn't manage. The bone preparations it created had become standard teaching materials for medical students, and its surgical techniques were being studied and adopted by human surgeons. I never saw the bone collector clearly, never got close enough to understand exactly what it was, but I knew it had found a way to integrate itself into the human medical community, using its obsession with bones as a bridge between whatever it was and what we are. The perfect bone specimens it created were advancing surgical education and medical research in ways that nobody fully understood. I quit the medical waste route after that and went back to EMT work. But sometimes, when I'm in the hospital with a patient, I see bone models and anatomical displays with that same perfect precision I remember from those containers in Spider Gap. They're marked as coming from various medical supply companies, but I recognize the surgical work, the careful dissection, the perfect cleaning, the methodical organization. The bone collector didn't just gather bones. It became the best surgical instructor in the mountains, teaching medicine with death. And somewhere up in Spider Gap, it's probably still working, still learning, still contributing to medical knowledge in ways that nobody talks about but everybody benefits from. I still drive through those mountains sometimes for work, but I never take the Spider Gap route anymore, because I know that whatever lives up there has found its place in our world, and maybe that's exactly where it belongs. I'm Kevin, and I was 29 in 2019 when I started hauling scrap metal through the Virginia mountains and fed something that shouldn't exist. Back then, I'd been working salvage for about 6 years, ever since I got out of auto repair. You learn to tell good metal from junk pretty quick in that business. The sound it makes when you drop it, the way rust forms, how clean a cut looks. I had a regular route picking up scrap from yards scattered through the Appalachians, loading my flatbed and hauling it down to processing plants in the valley. It was honest work, and I knew metal well enough to spot valuable stuff the yard owners sometimes missed. The money was decent, especially when you found a yard that kept quality scrap. Most places, you'd get mixed loads, some good steel, plenty of rust, maybe some aluminum if you were lucky. But there was this one place up near Iron Mountain that was different from the start. They specialized in vintage car parts and military surplus, stuff that came out of the mountains from old operations nobody talked much about. The owner was this weathered guy named Earl who'd been running the yard since before I was born. Never said much about where he got his metal, just told me to come by once a month, and he'd have loads ready. First time I pulled into Earl's yard, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. The scrap was sorted better than anything I'd ever seen. Steel separated by grade, aluminum clean as new pennies, copper wire stripped perfect. Everything cut precise, no jagged edges from torches or saws. The metal looked like it had been cleaned in some kind of acid bath, not a speck of rust or paint. Earl just shrugged when I asked about his processing setup, said he had old mountain ways of getting things done right. I should have asked more questions. Looking back now, I wish I had. The yard was tucked way back in a hollow, maybe 15 miltas, as off the main road through winding gravel that my GPS couldn't track half the time. Earl's trailer sat at the front, but the actual scrap piles stretched back into the trees where I couldn't see the end of them. He always had my loads ready when I arrived, stacked neat on pallets, paperwork filled out perfect. Best quality metal I'd ever hauled, and it always passed inspection at the plants without question. But there were things that didn't add up. Earl's yard had no visible equipment for cutting or cleaning metal. No torches, no grinders, no acid tanks, nothing that could produce the kind of work I was seeing. I'd hear sounds from back in the trees sometimes while I was loading. Metal being cut, grinding, the ring of steel on steel. When I asked Earl about it, he'd just say he worked nights when it was cooler. The metal itself was starting to bother me too. Some pieces had these marks along the edges that looked almost like bite marks, if that makes sense. Perfectly spaced indentations, too regular for cutting tools, but too precise for damage. And there were always these little piles of metal dust scattered around, like something had been chewing on the lower grade stuff and spitting out what it didn't want. It was my 4th month picking up from Earl when I started finding the really weird evidence. Tracks around the scrap piles that looked human but wrong, too wide, with deep gouges like claws had scraped the dirt. The tracks were always around the areas where the metal looked freshest, where those bite marks were deepest. I started paying attention to which pieces had the marks, and they were always the cheaper metals: rebar, basic steel, old iron. The premium stuff was untouched. Earl noticed me looking at the tracks one day and got real quiet. Finally said something about having a partner who works the night shift, and that I shouldn't worry about it. But he wouldn't look me in the eye when he said it, and that's when I started getting really uneasy about the whole operation. The truth hit me on a pickup in late fall. I'd arrived earlier than usual, around dusk instead of full daylight, because I had 2 loads to move that week. Earl wasn't in his trailer, but he'd left a note saying my load was ready in the back section. I drove my flatbed deeper into the yard than I'd ever been, following tire tracks through the trees. That's when I saw it working. The thing was maybe 8 feet tall, moving around a pile of scrap steel with purpose. At first glance, it looked like a person in some kind of work suit, but then it turned toward my headlights and I saw its face. The jaw was wrong. Too wide, hinged in a way that let it open further than anything human. And its teeth weren't teeth at all. They were metal, different grades and colors, like it had been collecting and installing them over years. It froze when my lights hit it, a chunk of rebar hanging from its mouth like a dog with a bone. Its body was patched with metal plates, some rusted, some shining new, all fitted together like armor that had grown instead of been built. When it moved, I could hear the pieces grinding and clicking against each other. I sat in my truck for maybe 10 seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. The thing tilted its head, studying me, and I realized it was deciding whether I was a threat. Its metal teeth caught my headlights, and I could see drool mixed with metal shavings dripping from its jaw. Then it went back to eating. I watched, frozen, as it bent down and picked up a piece of angle iron. It bit through the metal like it was a candy bar, chewing thoughtfully, the sound like a grinder running at low speed. After swallowing, it moved to the next piece, a strip of sheet steel, and repeated the process. It was being selective, choosing specific pieces and leaving others untouched. The thing worked methodically, consuming the lower-grade metals and arranging the premium materials into neat piles. Its body seemed to assess the metal, integrating useful pieces into its armor while dissolving the rest. I could see its chest plates shifting and changing as it fed, upgrading itself with better alloys. When it finished with one pile, it moved to another, and that's when I realized the scope of the operation. This thing had been processing Earl's entire inventory, night after night, eating the junk and leaving behind only the valuable materials. Earl was essentially selling the leftovers from a metal-eating creature's diet. I don't know how long I sat there watching, but eventually the thing noticed me again. This time, instead of freezing, it approached my truck. Not aggressive, just curious, like it was trying to figure out what kind of metal my vehicle was made from. It walked around the flatbed, occasionally reaching out to touch the steel frame with fingers that were more like precision tools. Up close, I could see that its metal integration was incredibly sophisticated. The pieces weren't just attached to its body. They were part of it, connected to what looked like organic material underneath. Its eyes had metal flecks in them, and when it breathed, I could hear the sound of air moving through metal chambers. The creature eventually lost interest in my truck and went back to work. I realized I was witnessing something that had probably been going on for decades, maybe longer. Earl hadn't just been running a salvage yard. He'd been feeding this thing in exchange for perfectly processed metal. I started my engine real quiet and backed away slowly. The creature glanced at me as I left but didn't follow. Earl was standing by his trailer when I got back to the front of the yard, and he just nodded like everything was normal. "Your load's ready," he said, pointing to a pallet of pristine steel. "Same as always." I loaded the metal without saying anything about what I'd seen. What was I going to say? That his business partner was a metal-eating monster? That he'd somehow made a deal with something that shouldn't exist? The weird part is, I kept going back. The metal was too good, the money too consistent. And the thing, I started thinking of it as Earl's partner, never bothered me. It seemed to understand that I was part of the supply chain, just another piece of the operation that kept it fed. Over the next few months, I started to appreciate what I was seeing. This creature had a better understanding of metallurgy than most engineers. It could identify the exact composition of alloys just by tasting them. It knew which metals were worth saving and which were just taking up space. Its processing methods were more efficient than any industrial operation I'd ever seen. Sometimes Earl would have special orders, requests from manufacturing companies for specific grades of metal with impossible purity standards. The creature could deliver every time, producing materials that exceeded anything human technology could create. Earl was basically running a metallurgy consulting service with a partner who had evolved beyond human limitations. I learned to time my pickups for after the creature had finished its work. The metal I hauled from Iron Mountain became legendary among the processing plants. Engineers would specifically request Earl's materials because they knew the quality was guaranteed. Nobody asked how he achieved such consistent results. The last time I saw the creature clearly, it had evolved even further. Its body was almost entirely metal now, but not randomly patched like before. It had achieved a kind of artistic integration with flowing lines and perfect proportions. It moved like liquid metal, its form constantly adapting and improving. It was creating things too, not just processing scrap. I found these incredible metal sculptures scattered around the yard, complex geometric shapes that seemed to defy physics. When I asked Earl about them, he said his partner liked to express itself during downtime. The creature had become something beyond just a scrap processor. It was an artist, an engineer, a metallurgist operating at levels humans couldn't reach. And Earl's little salvage yard had become the unlikely center of advances in materials science that were spreading through the entire industry. I moved away from Virginia in early 2020, took a job closer to home, but I still think about Iron Mountain, about Earl, and his unusual partner. The metals industry has advanced rapidly in the past few years, with new alloys and processing techniques that seem to come from nowhere. When I see articles about breakthrough materials or revolutionary manufacturing processes, I wonder if they trace back to a creature in the mountains that learned to turn hunger into innovation. The hunger of Iron Mountain didn't just eat metal, it became the future of metallurgy, showing us what our industry could become. Sometimes evolution takes paths we never expect, and sometimes the most important partnerships form in places we'd never think to look. I'm Carlos, and I was 26 in 2017 when I started driving fuel tankers and encountered something that steals time itself. Back then, I'd been managing a gas station down in Asheville for about 3 years, but the pay was garbage and I was getting tired of dealing with drunk college kids every weekend. My buddy Jake had been hauling hazmat for a trucking company up in Tennessee, and he kept telling me how much better the money was. Said if I got my CDL with the hazmat endorsement, I could make twice what I was pulling in at the station. Honestly, I knew fuel systems pretty well from working the pumps, and I figured driving couldn't be that much harder than what I was already doing. The training took about 2 months, but once I got certified, the company put me on the mountain routes. I was hauling gasoline to those little stations scattered all through the Appalachians, places so remote you'd wonder how they stayed in business. Most of these runs were pretty routine, just long drives through winding mountain roads with some of the most dangerous cargo you can imagine sloshing around behind you. One wrong move, one blown tire on a curve, and you're looking at an explosion that'll take out half a mountainside. But the pay was good, and after a few months, I got comfortable with it. There was something peaceful about those mountain drives, even with 8,000 gallons of gasoline following behind me. The Raven Hollow run was one of my regulars. Every month, I'd make the drive out to this isolated valley where there was just one gas station serving maybe 100 square miles of nothing but forest and old mining roads. The place was owned by this older guy named Roy who'd been running it since the 70s. Nice enough fellow, but he barely spoke above a whisper and had this way of looking at you like he was trying to figure out if you were real or not. The station itself, is just a couple pumps, a small convenience store, and a garage bay that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. But Roy paid on time, and the company liked the contract, so I made that drive every month without fail. I always left the depot at exactly 6 a.m. for the Raven Hollow run. It was about a 4-hour drive each way if you took it easy on those mountain curves, which you had to with a full tanker. I'd usually arrive around 2 p.m., spend an hour offloading the fuel and doing the paperwork with Roy, then head back. Home by 10 p.m. if traffic was decent. It was predictable, and I liked that. In this job, predictable meant safe, and safe meant you got to see your family at the end of the day. The first time something went wrong, I didn't even notice it at first. I made the delivery just like always, left at 6 a.m., took my usual rest stops, arrived at Roy's station. But when I was finishing up the paperwork, I happened to glance at my watch and nearly dropped my clipboard. It was 8 p.m. According to my watch, I'd been driving for 14 hours, not 8. I checked my phone, checked the clock in the truck, even asked Roy what time it was. They all said the same thing, 8 p.m. Roy looked at me with that strange expression of his and said, "You're running late today, Carlos. Expected you around 2, like always." I just stared at him. "Roy, I left at 6 a.m., same as always. Took the same route, same stops." He shrugged and went back to his paperwork, but I could see him watching me out of the corner of his eye. I'd driven this route dozens of times. I knew every curve, every landmark, every mile marker. There was no way it should have taken 14 hours. But there was my logbook showing the extended journey time. There was my fuel gauge showing I'd burned more diesel than usual. And there was Roy, acting like I was 6 hours late for an appointment I'd never missed. The Reeve back took exactly 4 hours, just like it always did. Time moved normally. My watch kept perfect time with the radio, with my phone, with everything. It was like whatever had happened. On the way there just didn't happen on the way back. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of mistake. Maybe I dozed off at a rest stop and lost track of time. Maybe my watch had malfunctioned somehow. But deep down, I knew something was off. You don't just lose 6 hours of your life and not remember it. The next month, I paid closer attention. I timed every landmark, every mile marker, every turn. Left at 6 a.m. sharp, just like always. And sure enough, when I arrived at Roy's station, it was 8 p.m. again. 6 hours had vanished somewhere between the depot and Raven Hollow, and I had no memory of them. According to my speedometer, I'd maintained normal speeds the whole way. According to my fuel consumption, everything was normal. But according to the clock, I'd been driving for 14 hours through a route that should have taken 8. This time, I pressed Roy about it. "This is the second time I've been 6 hours late. Are you sure you have the right delivery time?" Roy just looked at me with those pale eyes of his. "Carlos, you've been delivering here for 8 months now. Always supposed to arrive at 2 p.m. Always been late these past 2 months. Everything all right with you?" I wanted to argue, but what could I say? The clocks didn't lie. The logbooks didn't lie. Only my memory seemed to be telling a different story. I started bringing a stopwatch on the third trip. I'd click it at every mile marker, timing the sections of road. Most of the route checked out perfectly. The right amount of time for the right amount of distance. But there was one section between mile markers 23 and 31 where things got weird. That 8-mile stretch was taking me 4 hours to drive. 4 hours for 8 miles, even though my speedometer showed I was maintaining 45 to 50 miles per hour the whole time. It was like the road had stretched itself out, added distance that shouldn't exist. I tried different approaches. I drove faster through that section, speedometer showing 60 miles per hour, but still taking 4 hours to cover 8 miles. I drove slower, thinking maybe the speedometer was wrong. Same result. I tried different routes, but there was only one road to Raven Hollow, and it went right through that section between markers 23 and 31. The breakthrough came when I started paying attention to the landmarks. There was this distinctive rock formation about 2 miles past marker 23, looked like a giant's chair carved out of the mountainside. The first time I saw it, I noted the time. 30 minutes later, I saw it again. Same rock formation, same angle, same everything. Like I'd driven in a circle, except the road was straight. I saw that rock formation 4 times on one trip. 4 times, each about 30 minutes apart. Each time like it was the first time I was seeing it. But I never remembered turning around. I never remembered any loops or detours. In my memory, I was driving straight down a mountain road, just like I had dozens of times before. That's when I realized what was happening. The road was repeating itself. Between mile markers 23 and 31, the highway was caught in some kind of loop, playing the same 8 miles over and over again without me realizing it. I was driving through the same section 4 times, but only remembering it as one continuous drive. I tested this theory by paying attention to my CB radio. Truckers use Channel 19 for traffic reports, and there's usually someone broadcasting road conditions every hour or so. During that strange 4-hour section, I heard the same traffic report 4 times, word for word, same voice, same timestamp. The radio was looping along with the road. Once I knew what to look for, I could see it happening. The same curve, the same tree line, the same mile marker appearing again and again. But it was subtle, like déjà vu. If you weren't paying attention, if you weren't specifically looking for it, you'd never notice. Your mind would just accept it as a long, winding mountain road. I tried everything to break out of the loop. I tried different speeds, different lanes, even stopping the truck and getting out to walk around. Nothing worked. The road held me for exactly 4 hours, 4 repetitions of the same 8-mile section, then released me to continue normally to Raven Hollow. After the 5th month of this, I started talking to other truckers at the depot. Turns out I wasn't the only one. There were 3 other drivers who'd experienced time loss on mountain routes. One guy, Tom, had been dealing with it for 2 years on a route up in Virginia. Another driver, Maria, had a similar experience on a highway in Kentucky. But my route was the worst. 6 hours lost every month, regular as clockwork. Tom and I decided to do some research. We spent our off time at the library, looking up old newspaper archives, trying to find anything unusual about our routes. What we found changed everything. In 1973, there had been a massive accident on the highway between mile markers 23 and 31. A winter storm had caught a convoy of vehicles, 2 cars, a school bus, and a semi-truck carrying heating oil. The truck had jackknifed on black ice, and the other vehicles couldn't stop in time. 7 people died, including 3 kids on the bus. The heating oil had spilled and caught fire, burning for hours before emergency crews could get there. The more we researched, the more details we found. The accident had happened around 2 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. The emergency response had taken 6 hours because of the storm and the remote location. The victims had been trapped in the wreckage for hours, calling for help on their CB radios until the batteries died. I started carrying a better CB radio, one that could pick up weaker signals. During my next trip through the loop, I turned it to emergency frequencies and listened. That's when I heard them. Faint voices calling for help, reporting accidents, asking for ambulances. The same voices, the same calls, repeating every 30 minutes along with the road. They were still there, the people who had died in that crash, still calling for help, still waiting for rescue that would never come. And somehow, the road remembered. It kept replaying those last 6 hours, the time between the accident and when the last victim had finally died. I wasn't just caught in a time loop, I was caught in their time loop. I was experiencing their final hours over and over again, driving through their last moments without realizing it. The solution came to me during my 6th trip through the loop. I pulled over at what I thought was the accident site. You could still see scorch marks on the guardrail if you knew where to look. And I got out of the truck. I stood there for a minute, listening to those faint voices on the CB, and I said out loud, "I see you. I know what happened here. I'm sorry." The voices stopped. The loop broke. I got back in the truck and drove straight through to Raven Hollow in normal time. The next month, I brought flowers. Left them at the accident site with a small sign. In memory of the victims of the 1973 accident, you are not forgotten. The time distortion weakened. Instead of 6 hours, I only lost about 30 minutes. I started talking to other truckers, telling them about the memorial site, encouraging them to stop and pay their respects. Tom and Maria started doing the same on their routes. The more drivers who acknowledged what had happened, who showed respect for the victims, the weaker the loops became. It took almost a year, but eventually the trucking company that serviced that route got enough complaints about timing issues that they agreed to fund a proper roadside memorial. Nothing fancy, just a small granite marker with the names of the 7 victims and date of the accident. After the memorial was installed, the time distortion stopped completely. I could drive to Raven Hollow in exactly 8 hours every time. Other truckers reported the same thing, normal travel times, no more lost hours. Roy noticed the change too. "You've been on time for the last 3 months," he told me during one delivery. "Good to see you got your scheduling figured out." I never told him what had really been happening. I'm not sure he would have believed me, but sometimes when I was finishing up the paperwork, I'd catch him staring out at the road with that strange expression, like he was listening for something that wasn't there anymore. I kept driving the Raven Hollow route for another year before I transferred to local deliveries. Wanted to be home more with my family. But I still drive past that memorial sometimes, and I always slow down, show some respect. Because I learned something important on that mountain road. Some tragedies are so profound that they leave scars in time itself. And sometimes, the only way to heal those scars is to remember the people who created them, to acknowledge their pain, and to make sure they're not forgotten. The echo of Raven Hollow wasn't haunted by ghosts, it was haunted by time itself, and only respect for the dead could set time free.